The sun over Las Piedras was not a creator, but a hammer. It beat down on the cracked earth until the dust itself seemed to bake, rising in shimmering waves that distorted the distant purple mountains into something from a fever dream. Wind was the town's only other constant, a hot, ceaseless whisper that carried the grit of the New Mexico desert into every home, every throat, and every prayer. It was a sculptor of sorts, smoothing the corners of adobe buildings and carving deep lines into the faces of the few people who called this place home. Eli Carter rode in with the afternoon glare, a solitary figure so coated in the pale dust of the trail that he and his horse seemed one entity, a ghost conjured from the parched land itself. He moved slowly. His body canted slightly to the left, a subtle, ingrained habit that favored an old wound in his right shoulder. The war had given him that, along with a quiet that now lived behind his eyes. It was a quietness that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the stillness before a storm, filled with things seen and things done. He was not looking for trouble or for work, only for a respite from the relentless sun, a cool drink, and a moment where the wind did not feel like it was trying to scour him clean from the inside out. The town consisted of one main street, a collection of tired wooden and adobe structures huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent emptiness that surrounded them. He saw the sign for the saloon first, its letters faded by the sun, but his gaze slid past it to the adjacent building, Quinn's Boarding House and Inn. It looked quieter, a place of shade rather than shadow. He swung a leg over his horse, his movements economical and weary, and tethered the animal to a worn hitching post. For a moment, he stood there, letting the ache in his shoulders settle, his eyes scanning the street. There was no life, only the oppressive heat and the eternal sigh of the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, wood smoke, and something else. Something clean like lye soap. It was dim, the light from the dusty windows filtered and soft. A young woman was behind the long wooden counter, polishing a glass with a plain cotton cloth. Her movements were methodical, her focus entirely on the task at hand. That was the first thing Eli noticed about her, the concentration, the way she inhabited the small, simple action as if it were the most important thing in the world. She was Nora Quinn, the daughter of the proprietor, though she ran the place with a quiet authority that belied her years. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled back from a face that was more striking than beautiful. There was a fineness to her bones, a delicacy that seemed at odds with the harshness of Las Piedras. But her eyes, a deep and thoughtful gray, held a knowledge of that harshness. They were eyes that had seen the world break and had learned to live with the pieces. She had lost her family years ago on the trail west, a brutal and swift violence that had left her an orphan in the care of her aging father, the only other survivor. The memory was a ghost that lived in the corners of the inn, in the silences between conversations, in the way she would sometimes pause, her hand frozen mid-air, listening for a sound that was no longer there. She looked up as the door creaked shut behind him, the sudden dimness making his silhouette stark and imposing. He took off his hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He ran a hand through it, a gesture of exhaustion, not vanity, and then their eyes met. It was not a spark. It was a collision of two deep silences. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but a flicker of recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of a fellow solitary soul. He saw a fragility that was not weakness, but a kind of resilience, like a desert flower that blooms against all odds. He saw something tremble there, deep within the gray of her eyes. It was the vibration of a life that was both terrified and fiercely determined to continue. Nora, for her part, saw the vast, empty plains in his eyes. She saw the dust of 100 nameless roads, the weariness of a man who had been moving for a long, long time. But beneath the exhaustion, she saw something else, something guarded and painful. It was a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room, a weight that seemed to press the air down around him. She was accustomed to the coarse, loud men who passed through Las Piedras miners, ranchers, drifters whose emptiness was a void they tried to fill with whiskey and noise. This man's emptiness was different. It was a space filled with ghosts. It did not repel her. It drew her in. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, more substantial than the wind whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. The silence was not awkward. It was a language all its own, a conversation of shared burdens held across the space of a dusty room. "Whiskey," he finally said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse and trail dust. Nora nodded, her movements fluid as she broke the gaze to retrieve a bottle and a clean glass. She poured the amber liquid and slid it across the polished wood of the counter. Her hand, he noticed, was steady, slender, but capable. There were no tremors there. The shaking was somewhere deeper. He paid with a few coins he drew from a worn leather pouch, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. Her skin was cool. He wrapped his hand around the glass and drank, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He did not gulp it down like a thirsty man, but sipped it, letting the warmth spread through his chest, a temporary truce with the coldness inside. For the next hour, he sat at a small table in the corner, nursing the single glass of whiskey. He watched the room, but his attention always drifted back to her. He watched her speak quietly with her father, a stooped, white-haired man who emerged from a back room, his eyes ready but kind. He watched her serve a plate of stew to one of the few other patrons, a tired-looking prospector. She moved with a purpose that seemed both practiced and innate. She was the still point in this world of wind and dust. Nora was acutely aware of him in the corner. It was a strange sensation, a prickling on her skin, as if his gaze had a physical weight. She had seen men look at her before, with hunger or casual curiosity. This was different. It felt as if he were not just looking at her, but through her, seeing the fractured parts she kept so carefully hidden. It should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel seen. For the first time in a very long time, she felt as though someone saw the entirety of her, the fear and the fight all tangled up together. As the afternoon wore on, the quality of the light began to change. The pale, white-hot glare softened, turning a dusty gold, then a bruised orange. But with the changing light came a change in the wind. The steady, sighing whisper began to pick up, a low moan that rattled the window panes. The dust outside thickened, no longer a haze but a swirling, agitated cloud. Her father looked up from his accounts book, his brow furrowed. "Storm's coming up. A bad one." The prospector grunted his agreement, quickly finishing his stew and heading for the door, eager to secure his mule. The wind snatched the door from his hand as he left, slamming it shut with a loud crack that made Nora jump, her hand flying to her throat. Eli's eyes were on her. He saw the flicker of raw panic, the way her breath caught. He knew that sound, the sharp report that could be a slamming door or something far more final. He had seen what it did to people. Within minutes, the world outside the inn was gone, erased by a solid, roiling wall of brown. The wind was no longer moaning. It was screaming, a high, thin shriek of fury. It hammered against the building, and the old structure groaned in protest. Sand and dirt found their way through invisible cracks, dusting the floor, the tables, the very air they breathed. The light inside grew dim and murky, as if they were underwater. A loud creak from above made them all look up. A heavy ceiling beam, old and weathered, was visibly straining under the assault. A fine trickle of sand sifted down from a crack that had just appeared in the plaster. "Nora, get back," her father said, his voice tight with alarm. But she was frozen, her eyes fixed on the groaning wood above the counter where she stood. It was directly over the spot where she polished glasses every day, the spot she had occupied for years, her small, safe territory. Eli was moving before he had consciously made the decision to do so. The war had taught him that hesitation was death. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of pure, cold instinct. The beam groaned again, a noise like a dying animal, and he saw the wood splinter. He did not shout her name. There was no time. He reached her, his hands grabbing her upper arms, and he pulled her, hard, away from the counter and toward him, shielding her body with his own. They stumbled backward together, landing in a heap on the floor just as the beam gave way with a deafening crack of splitting timber. A section of the roof collapsed, bringing down a cascade of adobe, plaster, and thick, choking dust. It fell exactly where she'd been standing seconds before, smashing the counter and shattering the row of carefully polished glasses. The room was a chaos of noise and swirling debris. The wind howled through the new opening in the roof, and the roar was deafening. Eli lay half over her, his arms still protectively around her, his body taking the brunt of the smaller, falling pieces. The dust was so thick he could not breathe, could not see. He could only feel the frantic, bird-like hammering of her heart against his chest, and the fine, violent trembling that racked her entire body. Slowly, as the initial chaos subsided, the dust began to settle. He pushed himself up on one elbow, coughing, his eyes stinging. He looked down at her. Her face was pale beneath a layer of grime, her eyes wide with shock, fixed on the wreckage of her small, ordered world. She was shaking uncontrollably, a tremor that seemed to originate from the very core of her being. He leaned closer, his face just inches from hers, the world reduced to the sound of the wind and the frantic rhythm of their breathing. He could feel her tremors through his own body, a vibration that resonated with something deep inside him, something that had been shaking for years. Her lips parted, and a sound, barely a breath, escaped. "I'm shaking," she whispered. He looked into her terrified, beautiful, resilient eyes, and for the first time in a lifetime, he did not hide what was inside him. He let her see it, the shared and broken thing that was trembling in them both. "Me too," he answered, his voice low and raw. The dust settled slowly, coating every surface in a fine, gritty shroud. Old Man Quinn, Nora's father, stared at the hole in his roof, his face a mask of weary resignation. It was one more thing the desert had tried to take from them. But Eli Carter was already on his feet, brushing dust from his clothes, his eyes assessing the damage not with despair, but with a builder's practicality. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and a profound, ringing silence. In the days that followed, Eli did not leave. He had come to Las Piedras for a brief respite, but the collapsed roof had tethered him there. He made a quiet pact with Nora's father, not of coin, but of labor. He would stay and help repair the damage. He was a man who knew how to work. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands calloused and capable, seeming to understand the language of wood and adobe. He salvaged what timber he could, cleared the debris, and began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. Nora watched him, her heart a confusion of gratitude and a strange, unsettling awareness. The man who had saved her was now a constant presence, his quiet solidity a new feature in the landscape of her life. But Las Piedras was a town that survived on whispers, and a stranger was a story waiting to be told. The townsfolk, emerging from their homes to sweep sand from their doorsteps, watched Eli. They saw his competence, but they also saw the way he wore his pistol, low and easy on his hip, as if it were an extension of his arm. They saw the stillness in him, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, missing nothing. This was not the simple wariness of a common drifter. It was the coiled watchfulness of a man who expects trouble. The whispers began in the saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and suspicion. A mule skinner, passing through from the south, claimed to have seen a poster in a Texas town, a bank robbery, 2 men dead. One of the robbers had escaped, a dark-haired man with a quiet way about him and an old bullet wound in his shoulder. The description was vague enough to fit half the men wandering the territory, but it was a seed planted in fertile ground. The name on the poster, he thought, was something like Carter. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority came more from the tin star on his vest than from any real force of will, began to make a point of walking past the inn. He would nod curtly at Eli. His eyes narrowed, searching. The town's suspicion was a palpable thing, a change in the atmosphere as real as the coming of a cold front. Men stopped talking when Eli entered the general store. Women pulled their children a little closer as he passed. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a question mark, a potential danger. Nora heard the rumors. She heard them from Mrs. Gable at the Mercantile, her voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. She heard them from the ranchers who came in for a meal, their conversation ceasing the moment she drew near. Killer, robber, wanted man. The words were ugly, sharp-edged things, and they did not fit the man she saw. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horse. She saw the patience he had for her father's rambling stories. She saw the gratitude in his eyes when she brought him a cup of coffee in the cool of the morning. Her instincts, honed by a life of loss and the need for self-preservation, told her the town was wrong. There was darkness in Eli Carter, yes, a profound and sorrowful shadow, but it was not the mean, cruel darkness of a killer. It was the darkness of a wound. Yet, a new fear began to grow in her, one that had nothing to do with the rumors. She was afraid of the fierce, protective loyalty she felt for him. She was afraid of the way her breath hitched when he turned his gaze on her. She was afraid of the feeling that this man, this ghost from the plains, was somehow essential, that his leaving would carve a hole in her world far bigger than the one the storm had left in the roof. The work on the main building was slow, but the evenings brought a different kind of labor. The storm had damaged the small stable out back, loosening boards and weakening a support post. After the sun had bled its last colors across the horizon, leaving the desert air cool and smelling of dust and creosote, Eli would work by lantern light to make the repairs. And it was there, in the quiet intimacy of the falling dark, that they began to talk. It started with simple things. Nora would bring him a bucket of fresh water, and he would thank her, his voice less rough than it had been. She would ask about the work, and he would explain what needed to be done. His words spare but clear. She found herself lingering, leaning against the corral fence, the lantern light casting their shadows long and dancing on the packed earth. The stable, with its scent of hay and horse and warm leather, became a sanctuary, a place outside the judging eyes of the town. One night, emboldened by the darkness, she asked him where he was from. He was silent for a long moment, sanding a rough patch on a new board. A lot of places, he said finally. None of them home for very long. What about before she pressed gently, before all the places? He stopped his work and looked out into the vast, star-littered blackness of the desert. There was a farm in Ohio, Green Hills. A wife named Sarah. He said the name softly, as if it were a fragile thing he did not want to break. The war took that. It took her. He offered no more details, but Nora could feel the weight of the unspoken. He spoke of his wife not as a memory, but as a place he could no longer go back to. She understood that kind of loss. She told him then about her own family, about the wagon train, the sudden, shocking violence of the raid, the smell of gunpowder and fear. She had not spoken of it in years, but telling him felt different. He did not offer pity or clumsy words of comfort. He simply listened, his entire being focused on her, and his silence was a shared space, an acknowledgement that he, too, knew the language of ghosts. Each confession, however small, was like a shovel turning over hard-packed earth, slowly, painfully, digging towards something real. Her nights became restless, filled with dreams of him. They were strange, fragmented things, more feeling than narrative. In one, she was lost in a sandstorm, the wind screaming his name, and then his hand would find hers in the swirling chaos, warm and strong, and the storm would cease. In another, she would see him riding away, his back to her, and she would try to call out, but the desert wind would steal the words from her mouth, leaving her with a raw, aching throat when she woke. The man in her dreams was both the savior who had pulled her from the wreckage and the dark, solitary figure the town whispered about. His face half hidden in shadow. Waking, she would lie in her bed, her heart pounding, the scent of sand and wind seeming to cling to her sheets, real and imagined all at once. One evening, the repairs on the stable were nearly finished. He had reset the last of the posts, and the structure felt solid again, secure against the wind. A sliver of moon hung in the sky, offering just enough light to see by. Nora had brought him a plate of leftover stew, and he ate it sitting on an overturned bucket while she stood nearby. They had fallen into a comfortable silence. The only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft stamp of his horse in its stall. He finished the stew and set the plate aside. He stood up, and he was closer than she had realized. In the deep shadows, she could not read his expression, but she could feel the intensity of his presence. "Thank you, Nora," he said, his voice a low murmur. "For this, for everything." The air between them grew thick, charged with all the words they had shared and all the ones they had not. He took a half-step closer, and then, slowly, as if moving against a great weight, he lifted his hand, his fingers, rough with the work of the day, gently brushed against the back of her hand where it rested on the top rail of the fence. The touch was a brand, a spark of heat that shot up her arm and straight to her heart. It was too much, too sudden, a confirmation of the dangerous, fragile thing that had been growing between them in the dark. A gasp escaped her lips, and she pulled her hand back as if the fence were electrified. The motion was sharp, instinctual, a pure reflex of fear. But the fear was not of him. It was of herself, of the tidal wave of feeling that simple, fleeting contact had unleashed. She had retreated physically, but her gaze remained locked on his shadowy form. She could not look away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing trapped in a cage. He did not move, did not speak, his hands still hovering in the air where hers had been and in the silent, charged darkness of the stable. The space between them vibrated with a tension more powerful than any embrace, a silent admission of a shared and terrifying precipice. The charged silence that had fallen between them in the stable lingered for days. It was a tangible thing, a space around which they both moved carefully, their gazes meeting and then skittering away. A fragile truce had been broken. A line had been touched, and neither knew how to go back. Eli worked with a grim, focused intensity, speaking only when necessary. Nora went about her chores with a quietness that was heavier than usual, her heart a tangled knot of feelings she had no names for. The air was dry, waiting for a spark. It came on a Saturday night. The saloon next door was rowdy, its noise spilling into the relative quiet of the inn. A trio of miners, their faces raw from the sun and their pockets heavy with a week's pay, stumbled in, looking for more drink and a different kind of trouble. They were loud, their laughter bouncing off the low ceiling, their boots scraping mud and grit across Nora's clean floor. She served them whiskey, her expression carefully neutral, her movements economical, hoping they would drink and leave. Eli was at his corner table, nursing a cup of coffee, his presence a dark, quiet anchor in the room. He watched them, his eyes missing nothing, his body seemingly relaxed but for the tension in his jaw. "Well now, look at this little desert rose," one of the miners slurred, his eyes roaming over Nora in a way that made her skin crawl. He was a big man, with a thick neck and small, mean eyes. "All alone out here? Must get lonely." "Your whiskey, sir," Nora said, her voice even, placing the glass on the table well away from his grasping hand. His friend, a scrawny man with a stained beard, snickered Give us a smile. Sweetheart, it won't cost you nothing. Nora ignored him. Turning to go back behind the counter, the big man was faster. His hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. It was not a playful gesture. His grip was iron. Bruising. I'm talking to you, he growled, his breath sour with cheap liquor. Nora froze, a jolt of pure, cold fear flashing through her. The old terror of sudden, malevolent violence. Her father, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, appeared in the doorway, his face pale with alarm. Here now, gentlemen, he began, his voice thin and reedy. There is no need for... He never finished the sentence. From the corner of the room, there was a sound, not of a man rising, but of a chair scraping back with a slow, deliberate finality. Every eye turned. Eli was on his feet. He did not look angry. He looked empty, his face a calm, terrible mask, his eyes as flat and gray as a winter sky. He moved toward them not with a rush, but with a steady, unhurried pace that was far more menacing. Let her go, he said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the noise of the room, low and lethal. The miner holding Nora laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Or what, Cowboy you, and what army? He gave Nora's wrist a vicious twist. A small cry of pain escaped her lips. That was the last sound he made. Eli's movement was a blur of violence, so swift it was almost elegant. He did not go for his gun. His right hand shot out and grabbed the miner's shoulder, his fingers digging into the pressure point where the neck met the collarbone. The big man grunted, his grip on Nora slackening in surprise, in the same fluid motion. Eli's left hand came up, not as a fist, but as an open palm, striking the man hard under the chin. The man's head snapped back, his teeth clacking together with a sound like stones breaking. His eyes rolled back, and his large body went limp, crashing to the floor in a heap. The other two miners stared, their drunken bravado evaporating into stunned silence. Eli turned his flat, dead gaze on them. He did not speak. He did not have to. They scrambled backward, stumbling over each other in their haste to drag their unconscious friend out of the inn and into the night. The door slammed shut, leaving behind a ringing silence. Nora stood rubbing her wrist, her whole body trembling. Her father leaned against the doorframe, breathing heavily. Eli stood over the spot where the miner had fallen, his chest rising and falling slowly. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a flicker of something raw and haunted, as if the brief explosion of violence had dredged up ghosts he had long tried to keep buried. His gaze met Nora's, and in that look, a new and dangerous understanding passed between them. He was her protector, and he was capable of terrible things. The town did not see a protector. They saw a killer. The story, twisted and embellished with every telling, flew through Las Piedras like a brush fire. By morning, the whispers had become a single, damning verdict. The Quinn girl was consorting with a wanted man, a violent criminal. The quiet respect the town had always afforded Nora and her father curdled into suspicion and contempt. Mrs. Gable now counted Nora's change into her hand without ever meeting her eyes. Families who had once taken their Sunday meal at the inn no longer came. The invisible walls of their small community rose up, and Nora found herself on the outside. She was no longer just the quiet orphan. She was the criminal's woman. Sheriff Brody's visits became official. He walked into the inn, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, and his questions were no longer casual. He confronted Eli directly as he was mending a harness in the stable. "Carter," Brody said, his voice hard, "I got a wire from a marshal in El Paso. He is very interested in a man matching your description, a man who left 2 guards dead after a bank job." Eli did not look up from his work. "A lot of men match my description." "Sheriff?" "Maybe," Brody conceded, stepping closer. "But I knew Sarah. Back in Ohio, I knew her family." The name dropped into the quiet stable like a stone into a well. Eli's hands went still. "She wrote to her cousin about you, after the war, about the darkness you brought back with you. She was scared. A man who could frighten a woman like that is capable of anything. The accusation was not about a bank. It was about a ghost. It was about a past that had followed Eli across 1,000 miles of desert. Brody was not just a lawman. He was a self-appointed judge, and his verdict had been decided long ago. "You are a plague on this town." "Carter," Brody finished, his voice low with conviction. "I want you gone by tomorrow, or I will lock you up and wait for that marshal to come and collect you myself." That night, Eli knew he had to leave. He was poison, and he was tainting the only place, the only person, that had shown him any kindness. He packed his meager belongings into his saddlebags, but it was too late to ride out. Brody's deputy was already watching the inn from the saloon across the street. He was trapped. Nora found him in the stable, the lantern light casting long shadows around him. "He is watching the inn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You cannot leave." "I have to—" "Nora, I am bringing nothing but trouble to you and your father." His face was grim, etched with a self-loathing that was painful to see. "There is the old grain shed, behind the blacksmith's," she said, her mind working quickly. "No one ever goes there. You can wait there. Wait until the deputy is gone, until the town is asleep." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and he saw the terrible risk she was taking. But he also saw that he had no choice. Under the cover of a moonless sky, he slipped out the back and made his way through the alleys to the dilapidated shed, a ghost moving through a town that wanted him gone. Hours later, long after her father had gone to bed and the lights of Las Piedras had been extinguished one by one, Nora slipped out of the inn. She carried a canteen of water and a small parcel of bread and dried meat. The wind had risen, a lonely, keening sound that seemed to snake its way into her bones. Every rustle of a tumbleweed, every distant cry of a coyote, made her heart leap into her throat. But her fear for him was greater than her fear for herself. She found the grain shed, its door hanging crooked on a single hinge. She slipped inside, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the oppressive darkness. A single lantern burned in the far corner, its flame flickering weakly, casting more shadow than light. He was there, a dark shape rising to his feet as she entered, his gun in his hand before he recognized her. "Nora," he breathed, lowering the weapon. "You should not be here." "You need water," she said simply, holding out the canteen. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth in the cold, dusty air. He drank deeply, and she watched the line of his throat, the weariness in the slump of his shoulders. They were two people in a tiny, fragile shelter, with a whole world of judgment and danger howling outside. And then the wind, as if angry at their small defiance, slammed against the shed with a renewed fury. A gust tore at the old, rotten thatch of the roof. There was a sound of ripping, of straw and dried mud giving way, and a section of the roof was peeled back, torn away into the screaming darkness. The wind howled into the shed, extinguishing the lantern in an instant, plunging them into absolute blackness. Dust and bits of straw rained down on them. In the sudden, roaring dark, Nora cried out, stumbling forward. She felt his arms come around her, pulling her close, steadying her. The wind whipped her hair across his face, above them. Through the new hole in the roof, she could see the cold, distant light of the stars, impossibly far away. She was pressed against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and she began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that came from a place of pure terror and a desperate, aching need. "I'm shaking," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. He held her tighter, his face buried in her hair, his own body a taut line of tension. He was not a savior now, not a protector. He was just a man, as lost and as broken as she was. He breathed in the scent of her, of soap and wind and fear, and he felt a crack appear in the icy wall around his own heart. "Then shake with me," he murmured into her hair. his voice raw with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in a lifetime. They held each other in the roaring dark of the grain shed for a time that had no measure. It was not an embrace of passion, but of two solitary souls finding a momentary anchor in a storm. The wind howled, and the dust swirled, but in the circle of his arms, Nora felt the frantic trembling in her own body begin to quiet, replaced by the steady, solid beat of his heart, when the wind finally exhausted itself, receding into the vast desert silence. They parted slowly, the space between them now filled with a fragile, unspoken truth. He found his saddlebags and left before the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, a ghost melting back into the shadows, leaving her with only the memory of his warmth against the cold. The dawn that followed was deceptively peaceful. The sky washed clean and pale, but a different kind of storm was gathering. Just after the sun had climbed high enough to begin its daily assault on Las Piedras, they came, 5 riders, materializing out of the heat haze on the eastern road. They did not ride like weary travelers or purposeful ranchers. They rode with a loose, arrogant swagger, their horses kicking up dust with a casual disdain for the town's quiet. They were hard men, their faces burned by the sun and etched with a casual cruelty that was unmistakable. Nora was sweeping sand from the inn's boardwalk when she saw them. For a moment, she was just a girl watching strangers arrive. Then her eyes snagged on a detail. The man in the lead, a tall figure with a long, dusty coat, had a unique brand on his saddle, a stylized black spur. Her breath caught in her throat. The broom fell from her numb fingers. The world around her dissolved into a roaring sound, the sound of memory, sharp and terrible. The same brand, the same arrogant posture, the same cold eyes that had watched her family's wagon burn. Her ghost, the one she lived with every day, had ridden into town. Eli saw them from the window of the livery stable, where he had gone to collect his horse, intending to be miles away by now. He had seen men like this 100 times, vultures drawn to the scent of weakness. Then he saw the leader turn his head, and the sun caught the man's profile. Eli's blood went cold. He knew that face. He knew the mocking curl of the lip, the deadness in the eyes. It was Reeves, a man he had ridden with, fought beside, a man who had stood with him in the mud and blood of Shiloh, a man who had taken the war's lessons and twisted them into a creed of pure, predatory nihilism. Nora, her face a white mask of terror, found him there. She did not need to speak. He saw the recognition in her eyes, the resurrected horror, and he understood. The world, in its infinite cruelty, had brought his past and hers to the very same dusty street. The ghosts had converged. "It is him," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "The man who—" She could not finish. She did not have to. A muscle tightened in Eli's jaw. He looked from her terrified face to the men dismounting in front of the saloon, their laughter loud and grating in the morning quiet. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The long years of running, of trying to outpace the shadow of his past, came to an end. The debt he felt he owed to Sarah, the woman he had failed to protect from the world's darkness, and the debt he now felt to Nora, the woman he had just pulled from the wreckage, merged into a single, terrible imperative. This was not just Nora's fight. It had always been his. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. He turned to check his pistol, the motion practiced and final. "No," she said, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Eli, no, you cannot. There are 5 of them. They will kill you." "This is not something I can ride away from, Nora." "Yes, you can," she insisted, her voice rising with frantic desperation. We can leave right now. Ride west. We never have to look back. Please. I have seen what they do. I cannot lose you, too." The last words were a choked sob, a confession that laid her soul bare. She had already lost everything once to these men. She would not let them take him. He looked down at her hand on his arm, at her tear-streaked face, and his own expression was one of immense pain. "There are things a man has to do," he said, his voice rough. "Not because he wants to, but because he has to live with himself after. This is one of those things." It was his atonement, a chance, however slim, to face the man he might have become, to destroy a piece of the darkness he carried within himself. He gently pried her fingers from his arm. "Bolt the door of the inn, and do not come out, no matter what you hear." He walked out of the livery stable and into the blinding sunlight. He did not walk toward the saloon. He walked to the middle of the street and stopped. A solitary figure standing between the two rows of buildings, waiting. The bat-wing doors of the saloon creaked open, and Reeves stepped out, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He saw Eli, and a slow, mocking smile spread across his face. "Well, I will be damned," he drawled, his voice carrying in the still air. "Eli Carter, still trying to play the hero. Are you? I thought you would have learned your lesson by now. The world does not want heroes, Eli. It wants survivors." "This is not your town." "Reeves," Eli said, his voice calm and steady. "Get on your horses and ride out." Reeves laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. "I go where I please. I take what I please. You, of all people, should know that. We are cut from the same cloth. You and I, we saw the same things, did the same things. The only difference is, I am not ashamed of what I am." He took a long swallow from the bottle, then tossed it aside where it shattered on the hard-packed earth. The other 4 men emerged from the saloon, spreading out behind him, their hands hovering near their guns. The town seemed to hold its breath. Faces appeared in windows, then vanished. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway of his office, his face pale, his hand on his weapon, but his feet rooted to the spot. This was not a problem he could solve. This was a reckoning. "Last chance." "Reeves," Eli said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You first, Eli," Reeves sneered, and his hand dropped toward his gun. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Eli did not wait for Reeves to draw. He threw himself to the side, firing as he went. His first shot aimed not at Reeves, but at the man farthest to the left, who was already raising his pistol. The man grunted and stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Dust and gunpowder smoke filled the air, turning the street into a chaotic, hazy nightmare. Eli rolled behind a water trough, the wood splintering as bullets slammed into it. He came up firing, his movements economical and deadly. He was not a gunslinger in the romantic sense. He was a soldier. He used cover. He made every shot count. He anticipated their movements with a cold, clear precision born of battle. Another of Reeves's men went down, crying out as a bullet shattered his leg. From inside the inn, Nora heard the gunfire and squeezed her eyes shut, her hands pressed over her ears. Each shot was a physical blow, a spike of ice in her heart. She had done as he asked, bolting the door, but the sound was inescapable. She sank to the floor, her body racked with tremors, praying to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Outside, 2 of the remaining men tried to flank Eli, moving up the boardwalks on either side. He saw the move, fired once to keep Reeves pinned behind an overturned cart, then spun and shot the man on his right. The bullet caught the man in the throat, and he fell without a sound. Now it was just him, Reeves, and one other. The last man, panicked, broke cover and ran for the alley between the inn and the saloon. It was a foolish move. Eli's pistol barked once, and the man pitched forward into the dust. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the street. It was just him and Reeves. Smoke drifted on the still air. The sun beat down. "Just like old times." "Eh," Eli Reeves called out, his voice strained. "Only you were a better shot back then." Eli did not answer. He slowly got to his feet, his pistol held ready. He began to walk toward the cart, his boots crunching softly on the dusty ground. Reeves came up from behind the cart, his own gun blazing. The first shot went wide. The second did not. Eli felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through his side. The impact threw him back a step, and a gasp of air was punched from his lungs. He stumbled, but did not fall. He brought his own weapon up, his vision swimming, and fired again. Reeves stood for a moment, a look of surprise on his face. 2 dark spots appeared on his chest. He looked down at them, then back up at Eli. He opened his mouth to say something, but only blood came out. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward onto his face in the dust he had so arrogantly ridden in on. Silence. The battle was over. The street was littered with the consequences. Eli stood swaying, his pistol hanging limply in his hand. He looked at the bodies, at the blood soaking into the pail. Thirsty sand. There was no triumph, no relief, only a vast and hollow emptiness. He had won. He had paid the debt. He took a step, and his leg buckled. The pain in his side was a roaring fire. He pressed a hand to the wound, and it came away slick and dark with his own blood. He had to get to Nora. He had to let her know. He began the long, agonizing walk back to the inn. Each step a new mountain of pain. The townsfolk were emerging now, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They saw him not as a savior, but as a creature of the same violence he had just vanquished. He was a man stained with blood. The door to the inn was thrown open, and Nora was there, her face a mess of tears and dust. She saw him, saw the blood spreading across the front of his shirt, and a sound of pure anguish tore from her throat. She ran to him, heedless of the carnage around them. She reached him just as his strength gave out, catching him as he sagged, his weight almost taking them both down. She half dragged, half carried him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. She lowered him onto the floor, his head resting in her lap. Her hands were frantic, tearing at his shirt to see the wound. It was bad, a deep, ugly hole that was weeping blood at an alarming rate. "It is all right," he whispered, his voice a faint rasp. "It is over." Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his. She was shaking again, not with fear, but with a terrible, desperate grief. She ran to the bar, grabbing a bottle of whiskey and clean cloths. Her hands were slick with his blood as she tried to clean the wound, her movements clumsy with panic. She poured the whiskey over the raw flesh, and he cried out, his body arching in pain. "I am sorry," she sobbed. "I am so sorry." She pressed a cloth to the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood, but it soaked through almost immediately. He was so pale, his breathing shallow. She was losing him. After everything, after surviving the storm, the town, the past, she was losing him. Overwhelmed by a love so fierce it felt like it would tear her apart. She leaned down, her hair falling around his face. She did not kiss his lips. She pressed her mouth to the ragged, bleeding wound in his side, a desperate, hopeless sacrament of tears and blood and whiskey. She was kissing away the pain, the sin, the death, trying to hold him to this world with the sheer force of her will. She held him, her body trembling, and wept as the life he had fought so hard to protect bled out onto the floor of her home. Nora's desperate kiss could not stop the bleeding, but her father, his face ashen, arrived with the town's doctor, a man whose hands smelled of carbolic soap and whiskey. Together, they moved Eli to a bed in one of the back rooms. For 2 days and nights, he hovered in a gray twilight between life and death, his breath a shallow rasp in the quiet room. Nora never left his side. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and changed the blood-soaked bandages with a grim determination. She watched the life in him flicker and wane like a guttering candle flame, and in the long, silent hours of the night, she prayed. She prayed not with words, but with a fierce, silent concentration, willing her own strength, her own desperate desire for him to live, into his wounded body. Outside the quiet sick room, the town of Las Piedras had undergone a startling transformation. The whispers of suspicion had been replaced by a chorus of awed gratitude. The man they had shunned as a killer was now their savior. The bodies of Reeves and his gang had been dragged out to the desert and buried in unmarked graves. A final, Grim punctuation to their violent arrival. Sheriff Brody, his authority now completely overshadowed by Eli's brutal efficiency, supervised the grim task, his face a thunderous mask of resentment. Men who had once turned their backs on Eli now came to the inn, their hats in their hands, asking after his health. Mrs. Gable from the mercantile sent over a basket of fresh eggs and a jar of preserves. The town, which had cast Nora out, now embraced her again, seeing her as the loyal caretaker of their newfound hero. But the praise felt hollow, the gratitude a bitter irony. They were celebrating the very violence that had almost cost him his life, the same darkness that she had seen in his eyes and had come to understand not as malice, but as a deep and abiding pain. On the third day, the fever broke. Eli woke to find Nora asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms, her face pale with exhaustion. He watched her for a long time, a profound and aching tenderness filling his chest. She was a desert flower, blooming in the harshest of landscapes, and he was the storm that had almost uprooted her. He had brought death to her doorstep, and she had answered with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones. He did not deserve. His survival, he realized, was not a victory. It was a complication. He could not stay. To remain in Las Piedras would be to tether her to his past, to the wanted posters and the accusing eyes of men like Brody. He had saved her from Reeves, but he could not save her from himself. The life he had lived had left a stain on him, a mark that could never be washed away, and to love her would be to drag her down into that same darkness. When she woke and found him watching her, her tired face broke into a smile of such pure, radiant relief that it felt like a physical blow. Eli, she breathed, and in that single word was all the fear, all the hope, all the long hours of watching and waiting. In the days that followed, as his strength slowly returned, a new kind of quiet fell between them. It was not the tense, uncertain silence of before, but an intimacy so deep it required no words. She would read to him from a worn copy of her father's Bible, her voice a soft, soothing murmur. He would watch her hands as she mended his torn shirt, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of her fingers. They were two people who had passed through a fire together and had come out the other side irrevocably changed. But the world outside the sick room would not be held at bay forever. Sheriff Brody came to see him, his demeanor officially solicitous, but his eyes cold and hard. "The town is grateful. Carter," he said, standing at the foot of the bed, "but that wire from El Paso is still sitting on my desk. You killed 5 men. It was a fair fight, but it still leaves a lot of questions. As soon as you are fit to travel, I expect you to be on your way." It was not a suggestion. It was an order. The hero had served his purpose. Now the criminal had to disappear. That night, Eli told Nora he had to leave. He was sitting up in bed, the lantern light carving deep shadows into his face, making him look older, wearier. "Brody is right," he said, his voice low. "My being here puts you in danger. As long as I stay, the past will keep finding me, and it will find you too." "This is my home," she said, her voice fierce, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You are the one who made it feel safe again. You are the first person who ever made me feel like I did not have to be afraid when the wind blows." Her confession hung in the still air, a declaration of a truth so profound it made her own heart ache. He was not the storm. He was the shelter. "Nora, you do not know what I have done," he said, his voice ragged with a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. "The men I have been, the things I carry. I do not care about the man you have been," she answered, stepping closer to the bed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I care about the man who is here, right now." She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Stay, Eli, please, stay." Her plea was a temptation more powerful than any he had ever known. The thought of a life here, in this quiet place, with this woman, was a vision of a heaven he had long ago stopped believing in. But it was a false heaven, a peace he could not claim. He looked at her earnest, hopeful face, and the self-loathing that was his constant companion twisted in his gut. To accept her offer would be the most selfish act of his life. He took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers. "I cannot," he whispered. "But I will come back." The words were out before he had fully formed them, a promise born of a desperate need to give her something, a fragile thread of hope to cling to. "Once I have dealt with the past, once I have made sure it cannot follow me here again, I will come back. When the wind stops blowing, I will be back." He did not know if it was a promise he could keep, but he said it with all the conviction he could muster. That night, their last night, they stayed together in the small room. He was still too weak to move from the bed, and she sat in the chair beside him, her hand in his. There was no physical passion, no desperate joining of bodies. It was something deeper, quieter. It was the communion of two souls who had found each other in the wreckage. They talked for hours, their voices low murmurs in the darkness. He told her about Sarah, about the farm, about the way the war had hollowed him out, leaving him a stranger to the man he had once been. She told him about her parents, about her dreams of one day seeing an ocean, about the profound and crushing loneliness of her life before he had come. They were two hearts, trembling on the verge of breaking, clinging to each other in the darkness before the dawn. He felt the fine tremor in her hand and held it tighter, as if he could absorb her fear into himself. He was memorizing the feel of her skin, the sound of her breathing, the scent of her hair. He was gathering these small, precious things to take with him into the wilderness, talismans against the encroaching dark. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the window, he knew it was time. She helped him dress, her movements slow and deliberate, her face a mask of carefully controlled sorrow. He was still weak, his side a constant, throbbing ache, but he was steady on his feet. He pulled on his boots, the familiar weight a comfort and a burden. He stood before her in the gray light, and for a moment they just looked at each other, saying all the things that words could not. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "The desert remembers every tear. Nora," he said softly, "do not give it too many of mine." He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss that was a promise, a blessing, and a farewell all in one. It was chaste, and yet it was the most intimate touch he had ever given, a sealing of a bond that went deeper than flesh. He turned and walked out of the room without looking back. To look back would be to break. Her father was in the main room, and the two men exchanged a look of silent, masculine understanding. The old man simply nodded, a gesture of respect and farewell. Nora stood at the window and watched him lead his horse from the stable. A thick morning mist had settled over the desert, shrouding the world in a soft, gray veil. He mounted the horse, his movements stiff with pain, and for a moment he sat there, looking at the inn. She knew he could not see her, but she raised a hand, a small, futile gesture against the overwhelming distance that was about to open between them. He turned the horse and rode out, not toward the main road, but directly into the desert, a solitary figure quickly swallowed by the mist. She watched until he was completely gone, until there was nothing left but the swirling gray fog and the profound, aching silence he had left behind. She stood at the window for a long time, one hand pressed to the cold glass, the other pressed to her heart, offering a silent prayer into the mist, a desperate plea for the wind to one day cease, and for the man she loved to return. The mist that had swallowed Eli Carter burned away, and the seasons began to turn with the slow, grinding indifference of a millstone. The fierce heat of summer baked the adobe walls of Las Piedras until they were too hot to touch, and the dust of the street seemed to shimmer with a malevolent energy. Then came the autumn, when the wind carried a new chill from the purple mountains, and the sun's light turned thin and golden. Winter followed, brief but sharp, frosting the edges of the horse trough in the mornings and driving everyone indoors to huddle by their fires. Through it all, Nora waited. Hope, she learned, was a form of labor. Every morning she would rise and scan the eastern horizon, a habit as ingrained as breathing, searching for the silhouette of a lone rider. Every time a stranger rode into town, her heart would leap with a painful, frantic flutter, only to settle back into a dull ache when the rider proved to be someone else. His promise, "When the wind stops blowing, I will be back," became a cruel mantra. For the wind in the high desert never truly stopped. It was a constant presence, a ceaseless whisper that sometimes sounded like his name and other times like a lament for all that was lost. She did not simply wait. To do so would have been to let the emptiness consume her. In the small community of Las Piedras, there were always gaps to be filled, and Nora, with her quiet strength, found a new purpose. The town had a handful of children, a few orphaned by sickness, others left behind by prospectors who had followed a rumor and never returned. They ran wild, their minds as untended as the sparse desert grass. Nora began to gather them in the main room of the inn during the quiet afternoon hours. She taught them their letters, drawing shapes in trays of sand. She taught them numbers and read to them from the few books she owned. She was patient and kind, and the children, starved for such attention, blossomed under her care. In their hopeful faces, she found a reason to endure the long, silent days. She was shaping their futures, even as her own felt suspended, held in an agonizing state of waiting. But the nights were hers alone. The nights belonged to him. After her father had gone to bed and the inn was dark and silent, she would light a single candle and take out a small wooden box. Inside was a stack of paper and a pen, and every night she would write him a letter. She had no address, no way to send them. They were not for mailing, they were for surviving. She poured onto the pages everything she could not say to anyone else, her fears, her memories of his touch, her desperate, aching hope. She told him about the children, about the changing light on the mountains, about the way the town had finally accepted her back. The letters were a conversation with a ghost, a testament to a love that lived and breathed in the empty spaces of her life. She signed each one simply, Nora, and placed it in the box. The weeks turned into months. The stack of letters grew. The hope, once a burning flame, began to feel like a dying ember she had to constantly shield with her hands to keep from going out. The townspeople were kind, but they looked at her with a certain pity. They saw a good woman wasting her life waiting for a man who was never coming back. One night, she wrote the 40th letter. The winter winds were rattling the windows, a lonely, mournful sound. She wrote not of hope, but of a strange and terrifying peace that had begun to settle over her. "Eli," she wrote, the pen scratching in the quiet room. "It has been many months. The children can all write their names now, and a boy named Samuel can even read a whole page without stumbling. You would like him. He has your quiet way about him. A funny thing has happened. I have stopped shaking, even when the wind is loud enough to shake the walls. I find that I am still. I thought this is what I wanted, to not be afraid. But the stillness is not peace. It is just empty. A room where something precious used to be. My heart does not leap anymore when a stranger rides in. It just keeps its slow, steady beat. It is a lonely rhythm. Eli, please come back and make me shake again." She folded the letter and placed it in the box with the others. The stillness she had written of felt like a cold stone in her chest. A few days later, Sheriff Brody walked into the inn. It was late afternoon, and the children had just left. He took off his hat, a gesture that seemed strangely formal, and his face was grim. He did not look at her with his usual resentment, but with a kind of weary finality. "Nora," he said, his voice flat, "I have received a wire from the territorial marshal down at Fort Sumner." Nora's hands, which had been wiping down the counter, went still. She looked at him, and she knew. She knew by the absence of accusation in his eyes. By the way, he refused to quite meet her gaze. "It is about Carter," he said. "They caught him near the border a week ago. There was a shootout. He did not kill anyone this time, but the law is the law. They held a circuit trial. The marshals had warrants for him, for that old business in Texas, and for the killing of Reeves and his men here." "But he saved us," Nora whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He saved this town." "That is not how the law sees it," Brody said, his voice not unkind. "To them, it was not a defense of a town. It was one outlaw killing another. They do not care about the reasons. They only count the bodies. They have sentenced him to hang." The world tilted. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath her feet. The cold stone in her chest shattered into a million icy shards. He was alive. For a moment, a wild, delirious joy shot through her. He was alive. And then the rest of Brody's words crashed down on her. Sentenced to hang. The joy died, replaced by a horror so vast and absolute it stole the air from her lungs. "When?" she managed to ask, her voice a stranger's. "Day after tomorrow," Brody said quietly. "At sunrise." She did not cry. She did not scream. A terrible, cold clarity descended upon her. She nodded, a single, sharp movement of her head. Brody watched her for a moment, then turned and left, leaving the door open to the cold afternoon air. She did not hesitate. There was no thought, only a singular, driving purpose. She went to her room, pulled on a heavy coat and her sturdiest boots. She took the small wooden box of letters and tied it into a bundle with a few provisions, a canteen of water, a loaf of bread, a small bag of coins. She went to the stable and saddled the most resilient horse, a tough little mare that had belonged to her father. She moved with a speed and efficiency that would have surprised anyone who only knew her as the quiet schoolteacher. She rode out of Las Piedras as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal streaks of orange and red, like a fresh wound. She did not ride west, toward freedom. She rode southeast, toward Fort Sumner, toward the place where he was to die. The desert at night was a different world, a vast, cold, and menacing landscape. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, her old enemy, rose up, a physical force that pushed against her, trying to turn her back, but she leaned into it, her body low over the horse's neck, her eyes fixed on the cold, indifferent stars that would be her only guide. Sometime after midnight, the stars disappeared. The wind began to howl, picking up sand and grit, and soon she was riding through a full-blown sandstorm, a swirling, blinding chaos of brown. The mare whinnied in protest, wanting to turn and flee, but Nora held her steady, her voice a constant, low murmur of encouragement. The storm was a monster, trying to swallow her, trying to keep her from him. But she was no longer the girl who froze when the roof collapsed. Her love was a fire in her belly, a beacon in the roaring dark. She pushed on, hour after hour, a lone, determined soul battling the fury of the desert itself. She arrived at Fort Sumner just as the first hint of a bruised, gray dawn appeared on the horizon. She was caked in grime, her hair a wild tangle, her eyes red-rimmed and raw, but she had made it. The fort was a grim, formidable place of stone and adobe, built to withstand attacks, and it felt like a prison even from the outside. She slid from the saddle, her legs almost collapsing beneath her, and stumbled toward the main gate. A sentry, his face grim in the pre-dawn chill, stopped her, but she pressed a few coins into his hand and begged, her voice hoarse, to see the prisoner, Carter, just for a moment. Perhaps it was the desperation in her eyes, or perhaps it was the sheer fact that she had ridden through the storm to get here. The soldier hesitated, then nodded, leading her not to a cell, but to a small, barred window in a thick adobe wall. 5 minutes, he said gruffly, and left her there. She peered through the iron bars into the dim, lamp-lit interior, and then she saw him. He was sitting on a narrow cot, his back to the wall. He was thinner, his face pale beneath his tan. But it was him. Her heart, which had felt like a dead thing in her chest, gave a violent, painful lurch. He looked up, as if he had sensed her presence, and his eyes met hers through the bars. The weariness in his face was immense, but as he saw her, a flicker of disbelief, of wonder, of a deep and terrible sorrow passed through his gaze. He slowly got to his feet and walked to the window. They were inches apart, separated by the cold iron. He did not ask how she got there. He did not have to. He just looked at her, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. The full weight of it all, the ride, the storm, the sight of him in this place, broke over her in a wave. The cold stillness shattered, and the old, familiar trembling started deep inside her. A tremor that shook her from the soles of her feet to the tips of her fingers. Tears she had refused to shed now streamed freely down her dusty cheeks. "I am shaking again," she said, her voice a choked whisper. He reached his fingers through the bars, not quite able to touch her face. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, a look of infinite tenderness and heartbreaking finality. "Good," he said softly, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Means your heart's still alive." The 5 minutes the guard had allotted them were a cruel eternity, and a fleeting instant all at once. The sound of his returning footsteps on the gravel outside was a judgment, the grinding of a key in a lock the sound of their world ending. Nora did not pull away from the window. She stayed, her fingers pressed against the cold iron, her eyes memorizing the lines of Eli's face, the deep-set weariness of his eyes, the way a single lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. He did not speak again. There was nothing left to say that his gaze did not already convey a world of regret, a universe of love, and a profound, soul-deep apology for the end he had brought upon them both. The guard cleared his throat, his voice gruff with a discomfort he could not entirely conceal. "Time's up, miss." She was led away, her feet moving mechanically over the hard-packed earth of the fort's parade ground. She did not look back. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his gaze on her, a weight more real than the heavy coat she wore. She found a spot near the outer wall, a place where she could be alone, and sank down onto the cold ground, pulling her knees to her chest. She did not have the strength to ride away. To leave now would be a betrayal, a final abandonment. Her journey had not ended when she reached the fort. It would end when his did. She would be a witness. She owed him that. She owed it to the man who had taught her heart to shake again. The sun began its slow, merciless climb, a disk of pale, unforgiving light that offered no warmth, only illumination for the grim tableau being prepared in the center of the parade ground. The gallows stood stark and skeletal against the brightening sky, a dark geometrical problem waiting for its final, human solution. A small crowd gathered, mostly soldiers in their blue uniforms, their faces impassive, and a few grim-faced civilians from the nearby settlement who had come to see the law's grim work done. There was no festive atmosphere, only a heavy, somber silence, broken by the occasional cough or the jingle of a spur. Nora watched, detached, as if viewing a scene through warped glass. The world felt unreal, the sounds too sharp, the light too bright. She saw the territorial marshal emerge from the main building, a tall man with a stern, weathered face. A priest followed, his head bowed, a Bible clutched in his hands. And then, between two guards, came Eli. He was not shuffling or broken. He walked with a strange, quiet dignity, his head held high, his steps even despite the chains that bound his wrists and ankles. The chains did not clank. They made a soft, rhythmic whispering sound, a metallic sigh with every step. His face was pale in the morning light, but his eyes were clear, and they scanned the small crowd, the walls of the fort, and then, inevitably, they found her. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply held her gaze, and in that long, silent look, he gave her the last of his strength. They led him to the foot of the gallows steps. The marshal read the sentence in a loud, monotonous voice, the words about robbery and murder and the laws of the territory seeming to belong to another man, another life. When he was finished, he looked at Eli. "Do you have any last words, prisoner?" Eli was silent for a moment, his eyes lifting from Nora to the vast expanse of the desert that stretched out beyond the fort's eastern wall, now glowing under the rising sun. "I would like," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "to see the desert one last time, without the walls in the way." The marshal considered the request. It was unusual, but it was a small thing, a final mercy. He nodded curtly to the guards. "Take him up. Let him look his fill." They led him up the 13 wooden steps, the sound of his boots echoing in the profound silence. At the top of the platform, they turned him to face the east, to face the endless horizon of sand and rock and pale blue sky. He stood there, drinking it in, the landscape that was as much a part of him as the blood in his veins. It was a landscape of hardship and freedom, of loneliness and profound, stark beauty. It was the place he had chosen to lose himself, and it was the place where he had, for a brief, impossible time, been found. And then Nora was moving. She did not know what propelled her, only that she could not stay where she was. She rose to her feet and walked forward, her steps as measured and deliberate as his had been. She walked past the soldiers, who watched her with stunned surprise, past the marshal, who opened his mouth to stop her, but then seemed to think better of it. She walked to the foot of the gallows and slowly, deliberately, climbed the steps. The guards tensed, raising their rifles, but the marshal held up a hand. Nora did not look at them. She had eyes only for Eli. She came to a stop beside him, so close she could feel the faint warmth of his body through his thin cotton shirt. She looked not at his face, but out at the desert with him, sharing his final view. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold, the skin rough, the manacles a brutal weight between them, but his fingers, strong and sure, curled around hers, lacing through them, a final, solid connection in a world that was dissolving around them. He turned his head then and looked at her. His eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it was bottomless, but also with a love that was as vast and enduring as the landscape before them. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Do not cry, Nora," he said, his voice a low murmur, meant only for her. "The desert remembers every tear." The hangman, a burly man with a hooded face, stepped forward with a thick, coiled rope. The priest began to recite a prayer, the Latin words a meaningless drone. Eli ignored them both, his attention focused entirely on Nora, on the feel of her hand in his. The hangman moved to place a black hood over his head, but Eli shook his head slightly, a small but firm refusal. He would not die in the dark. He would die with his eyes on her, and on the open sky. The hangman hesitated, then shrugged, and instead settled the noose around Eli's neck. The rough hemp was a coarse and final embrace. Nora's grip on his hand tightened, her knuckles white. She could feel a fine tremor starting in his fingers, or perhaps it was in her own. The marshal gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. At that exact moment, a gust of wind swept across the parade ground. It was a lonely, powerful gust, born in the distant mountains and funneled through the vast, empty plains. It moaned around the corners of the buildings and whipped at the flag on its pole. It stirred the dust at their feet and tore at Nora's hair, whipping it across her face. There was a sickening crack as the hangman pulled the lever and the trapdoor beneath Eli's feet sprang open. The sound was followed an instant later by the sharp, final snap of the rope taking his full weight. His hand was ripped from hers, the sudden, violent emptiness, a physical blow. The wind howled, a long, rising shriek that seemed to tear the sky in two. It filled her ears, a sound of ultimate desolation, a sound that was both the world's grief and her own. Her heart felt as if it had been torn from her chest, leaving a ragged, gaping hole. The crowd was a blur, the gallows a nightmare shape against the sun. The only thing that was real was the wind, and the terrible, profound emptiness in her hand. Her whole body was convulsing now, the shaking so violent she thought she might fall apart. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. She whispered the words into the roaring wind, a final, broken message to the man who was gone. "I am shaking." And this time, he could not answer. The years, like the desert wind, had scoured Nora Quinn, smoothing the sharp edges of her grief into a landscape of quiet resilience. They had etched fine lines around her eyes, a map of countless sunrises and sorrows, and threaded her dark honey hair with the pure, stark silver of the moonlight on the dunes. She no longer lived at the inn, which had long ago passed to a new family, its rooms now filled with the boisterous sounds of strangers. Her father had been laid to rest in the small, dusty cemetery behind the town's clapboard church, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross that she tended with quiet devotion. Nora had built a life for herself, a small, sturdy thing, like the wooden house she now occupied. It stood a little way from the town, at the very edge of the vast, open desert, as if she had finally decided to live on the border between the world of people and the world of wind and memory. The house was simple, with a small porch where she would sit in the evenings, watching the mountains bleed purple and then black against the star-dusted sky. Her life was a quiet one, a rhythm of simple, meaningful tasks. She was the town's teacher. The children she had first gathered in the inn had grown, had married, and now sent their own children to her. They came to her small house every afternoon, their face bright with curiosity, and she would teach them to read, to write, to see the world not just as a place of hardship, but of wonder. And sometimes, when the wind was moaning a particular tune around the corners of the house, she would tell them a story. It was the town's foundation myth, the story of its salvation, and she was its sole keeper. She would tell them of a time when Las Piedras was a frightened place, preyed upon by cruel men, and into this fear, she would say, a stranger rode in, a quiet cowboy with sad eyes and a hero's heart. She would not speak of the blood or the terrible finality of the gunshots. Instead, she would describe his courage, the way he stood alone in the street, a solitary shield protecting the innocent. She never gave him a name in the story. He was always just the cowboy. He was a legend, a figure of pure, uncomplicated bravery, and the children would listen with wide, captivated eyes, seeing in her telling the birth of their own safe world. It was his legacy, the one she had chosen for him, not a killer, not a wanted man, but a guardian. The truth, in all its painful, bloody complexity, she kept for herself, locked away in a small wooden box that sat on the mantelpiece, a box filled with 40 unsent letters. Her days were full, but her nights were still. She had learned to live with the silence, to find a kind of peace in it. The violent shaking that had once defined her was a distant memory, a tremor from another life. The stillness she had once written of, the emptiness that had felt like a cold stone, had over the long years been warmed by the sun of her purpose, by the love she gave to the children, by the slow and steady work of living. She was no longer waiting. She was remembering. One afternoon in late autumn, after the last of her students had run off, their laughter fading into the dusty air, a strange quiet fell over the land. The wind, that constant companion, had died down completely. The air was unnervously still, holding its breath. The silence was so profound it was like a sound in itself, the same ringing silence that had followed the gunfight all those years ago. Nora stood on her porch, a simple woolen scarf wrapped around her neck against the coming evening chill, and watched the sky. The sun was setting, and the light had a strange, luminous quality, as if the air itself were made of gold dust. Then it came. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling, a vibration in the soles of her feet. A powerful current of air swept in from the east, a warm, deep, gust that was entirely different from the usual cold desert winds. It did not carry the scent of rain or the chill of the mountains. It carried ghosts. It rushed toward her, and as it hit the small house, it brought with it the distinct, unmistakable smells of old. Spent gunpowder in the dry, sun-baked sand of a lonely street. It was the scent of his last battle, the scent of his atonement, the scent of him. She closed her eyes, and she was no longer an old woman standing on a porch. She was a girl again, her hands slicked with his blood. She was standing at the foot of the gallows, his hand clutched in hers. She felt the violent, final wrench as the trapdoor fell, the way the wind had shrieked her grief to the sky. The memories did not come with the sharp, stabbing pain of before. They came as a flood of pure, undiluted feeling, a testament to the love that had been the pivot upon which her entire life had turned. It was a love that had cost everything and had given everything. It had broken her, and it had made her whole. A tremor started deep inside her, a faint vibration that grew until her entire body was humming with it. A string on a forgotten instrument suddenly plucked by a phantom hand. It was not the shake of fear. It was not the shake of grief. It was the shake of recognition, of a presence so powerful and so loved that it could move her soul even across the great, silent divide of death. She opened her eyes, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. A smile that erased the map of years and revealed the girl who had loved a broken cowboy with all her heart. She lifted her face to the wind, to the invisible presence that swirled around her, and she whispered to it, her voice soft and full of a peaceful, final wonder. I am shaking again. The wind, as if in answer, surged one last time. It caught the end of her woolen scarf, pulling it from her shoulders. It did not simply drop to the ground. The wind lifted it, unfurling it like a banner. It danced in the air for a moment, a flash of dark wool against the golden sky. And then it began to rise, higher and higher, a small, solitary thing climbing toward the heavens. It flew out over the desert, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a speck, a mote of dust that finally vanished, dissolving into the shimmering, timeless expanse of sand and sky, as if a spirit, finally free, had returned to wrap her in one last, invisible embrace. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.